fire. 16 houses had to be evacuated earlier today, and the Canterbury DHB issued a public health warning for smoke from the fire. It said people sensitive to smoke, such as those with heart or lung conditions, pregnant women, young children and the elderly, could suffer breathing and throat issues. Helicopters are still dousing the remaining fire, and crews will remain on site overnight. The wife of Canterbury man Donald Einarson, who died after the police shot at him 10 times, says their response was excessive. In its report on the incident in November 2018, the Independent Police Conduct Authority has found the 2 officers involved were legally justified in their actions. They'd gone to the couple's Darfield property after Mrs. Einarson said her husband was pointing a shotgun at her, and when they tried to stop him driving away, he drove into them, seriously injuring one of them. Shots were fired and he died a short time later. Mrs. Einarson says the nature of the injuries one officer received made her question his ability to make decisions. The new Economic Development Minister has been delivered a blunt message about New Zealand's lack of progress on climate change and the potential price tag that could result. The ministerial briefing says it's not currently on track to meet its Paris Agreement obligations, creating a large fiscal risk if the government ends up having to bear the cost of purchasing international units. The Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment says the government will need to make significant structural and investment changes this term to avoid future costs escalating even further. Invercargill police are appealing for information after at least 5 gunshots were heard at a residential property last night. The police received multiple calls after the gun was fired at the property on Kildare View in Waikiwi around 11 p.m, but no one was injured. The police say it appears the address was specifically targeted and they don't believe there is any risk to the wider public. A vehicle was seen leaving the area shortly after the shots were heard, and police are investigating possible links to a vehicle fire on Mill Road North around the same time. One of New Zealand's biggest New Year's Eve festivals will be live-streamed to the world. For the first time in the event's 18-year history, Gisborne's Rhythm and Vines will be on the streaming platform Twitch. More than 23,000 people attend the 3-day festival, which will now attract a global audience through a 5-hour showcase of headline acts and up-and-coming artists. That's the news.
This morning on First Up, an Auckland food bank takes us for a tour as they prepare for Christmas after their busiest year ever.
We were donated nappies and formula, so obviously we all know that that's really expensive for families. So part of it, when they apply online, we ask if they've got babies and what their needs are.
And we could be in a travel bubble with Australia next year. Will we be able to pull it off?
We've seen, particularly in Australia, most states there have had a longer period free of community transmission than New Zealand.
First Up, with me, Nathan Rarere from 5am weekdays on RNZ National.
RNZ National funded through New Zealand On Air. Back to Jesse Mulligan in a moment. But right now, time for our short forecast from Met Service to midnight Wednesday. All of the North Island fine, apart from a few areas of morning and evening cloud. Nelson and Marlborough fine. Bulla and Westland mostly cloudy but fine spells during the afternoons. Patchy drizzle tomorrow morning. Canterbury mainly fine, however some coastal low cloud this evening and tomorrow morning. Otago fine today, cloud increasing tomorrow and rain spreading north to Dunedin later afternoon or evening. Southland fine today, rain developing tomorrow afternoon. Fiordland areas of drizzle developing this evening, turning to rain tomorrow. And for the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods. RNZ National, it's 3:05. More news and weather, including the mountain forecast at 4.
And Jesse Mulligan with you till 3:45 today. As I said earlier, we are standing by to go to a government media conference on the plan for COVID-19 if there's an outbreak over the summer period. So expecting to hear from the Minister responsible for the COVID response, Chris Hipkins, and Director General Ashley Bloomfield. Also planning to speak to Dr. Harold McGee this hour. Harold is a specialist in smells. He's got a new book with a great title, Nosedive, and it summarises the 10 years he's spent looking at the science of smell. And we'll begin with what space smells like. Space has a very strong smell, you might be surprised to hear. Maybe you're not surprised to hear it because there was a space perfume they were marketing a few months ago. But anyway, how do we know what space smells like and what smell does it actually have? And if we get to it today, we're planning on hearing about Bing Crosby's White Christmas, one of the defining songs of World War II and how it ended up that way. Tomorrow on the show, by the way, I'm planning on speaking to Eric Bana, who has done all sorts of things, including The Castle and The Incredible Hulk. He played Chopper in that movie. And he's back in his native Australia. He is playing a federal detective in a movie called The Dry. So if the international hookup works as it's meant to, tomorrow at this time I'll be talking to Eric Bana. If there's anything you personally want me to ask him, not often we get someone quite as famous as him on the show, do feel free to send me a text message to 2101. As we wait to head to Wellington for that media conference, we'll go there as soon as it begins. Oh, yes? Looks like it might be coming. Okay, well, let me take another...
Kia ora everyone, good afternoon, sorry to keep you waiting. Today we're here to outline the extensive all-of-government planning in the event of any community case of COVID-19, should that arise during the summer holiday period. Shortly, the Director-General of Health is going to speak about the specific actions and preparedness across the health system. But firstly, I want to acknowledge the huge efforts of New Zealanders over what has been an incredibly interesting and challenging 12 months. During the last 12 months, New Zealand's significantly lifted its ability to respond to COVID-19. For example, we've improved our testing and contact tracing capability. That means that since the August resurgence in Auckland, we've successfully responded to at least 4 other outbreaks without having to move up alert levels. Other key things to highlight are the fact that we've processed in the last 3 months more than 470,000 tests. So that's an average of more than 36,000 tests per week, which is a significant advance on where we have been before, and it puts us amongst the highest countries in the world on a per capita basis for testing for COVID-19. We've seen significant increases in our contact tracing capability across our public health units, supported by district health boards. They now have the capacity to manage 350 low complexity cases per day and surge capacity to extend that to 500. The National Contact Tracing Solution has become fully operational and it's providing that support to the public health units. We've got very strong border orders governing our air and maritime borders and our managed isolation facilities, which are of course our front line of defence against COVID-19. We have mandatory testing of all border staff in place, those staff who are working in risky areas of the border where they could come into contact with the virus. And we've also been effectively balancing public health risk whilst managing economic impact. For example, finding ways to bring international sport back to New Zealand whilst keeping COVID-19 out of our community. We know that the virus continues to rage offshore, and despite our best efforts, there is always the potential for it to make its way across the border. So our summer planning approach to manage any cases over the holiday period supports our overall elimination strategy for COVID-19. We'll find it, we'll stamp it out, and we've made sure the government COVID-19 and the team and the National Support Network are ready. Although we can't predict exactly where or how a community case might emerge, New Zealanders can be reassured that planning has been extensive. And that's included scenario testing and understanding actions that might be needed, including, as a last resort, any changes to alert levels. The Director-General will have further comments around the health advice around when that might happen. More generally, though, I want to reassure the public that we'll continue to respond swiftly and openly to any issues that emerge around COVID-19 during the summer holiday period. If a positive case was found in the community, we'd use the usual approach to communicating with the public. Updates and advice would, in the first instance, be provided by me and the Director-General or someone acting on behalf of the Director-General. It's important to remember, though, that that's worst-case scenario, and we're doing everything we can to ensure that everybody can enjoy their summer holiday period. After a long, hard year, New Zealanders do deserve to have their summer holiday, including those who are working hard at our borders. We need to make sure that we take the pressure off them too. So let's thank each and every one of them by doing our bit to stop the spread of COVID-19. So again, as part of our Make Summer Unstoppable campaign, I'll remind you of our key messages. We should all be washing and sanitising our hands, scanning QR codes, turning Bluetooth on and using the COVID Tracer app, staying home when we are feeling unwell, and seeking advice around testing if we do start to show any symptoms. And if we're going on away on a break, please do think about what you might do should something happen and you be required to stay where you are for a period longer. So do you have a backup plan for your homes and your pets in the event that for any reason your return home may be delayed? It'll be the continued commitment of our team of 5 million, combined with the planning that we're outlining today, which gives us all the best chance of enjoying that fantastic Kiwi summer that we are all looking forward to, particularly those of us in Wellington who are still waiting for it. So I'll now invite the Director General to speak to you.
Thank you, Minister. Kia ora koutou katoa. So, we are coming to the end of a year that has felt longer than most, and I know Kiwis are looking forward to a well-earned break. We certainly are at the Ministry of Health. However, this will be our first summer with COVID-19 in our lives, and we need to be prepared for that. There's no doubt we have done well as a country this year, and to use a cricketing analogy, we do not want to drop a catch now. We know Kiwis will be travelling in large numbers outside of the main centres as they travel to lakes, beaches and campsites across the motu. And also camper vans, I understand, by camper van. People will also be attending events and festivals where the risk of transmitting infections, including COVID-19, is higher. It's important to remember that the reason we can safely attend such events is because we have been so vigilant to date. We know everyone will be keen to take time to relax and enjoy themselves. This does run the risk of letting our guard down, and let's not take that risk. We have undertaken across government extensive resurgence planning for 3 broad scenarios that could eventuate over the summer months. The first scenario involves a border worker testing positive as part of routine testing. In this situation, we would simply invoke our current test, trace and isolate response that has served us so well over recent months. The second scenario we have been rehearsing involves a member of the public testing positive, perhaps when they're on holiday at a campsite somewhere, a camping ground, but this person has a connection to the border somehow. This again would involve our test, trace and isolate approach, but it might also include some ramped up local testing, some targeted restrictions on movement, and potentially regional alert level changes may be required. The third and potentially most serious scenario that we have rehearsed involves a person testing positive after returning home, having attended a major event in a different region. Now, this scenario could lead to a nationwide increase in the alert level, testing and tracing being significantly ramped up around a number of regions and other events cancelled, and potentially people being asked to stay in place in their bubbles. In each of these scenarios, and in the second and third in particular, there are extensive contingency plans in place both across the health system and wider government. As I said earlier, let's not take the risk of those broader scenarios. What everyone at home needs to know firstly is how to do your bit to prevent that outbreak, and the Minister has rehearsed the actions that we want all New Zealanders to continue to do. And what I'd just like to remind people of are the symptoms you should be looking out for. If you develop symptoms of a runny nose, a sore throat, cough, fever, and in particular, a loss of the sense of smell or taste, then please do seek advice. Healthline is the place to go, and they will be able to tell you where you can get a test. If there is an outbreak where you are, of course there will be, as the Minister said, information being provided. We will inform everybody, and the advice is to stay in place where you are until we provide further advice about what to do. It's very important in the first instance people don't rush to get home and potentially take the virus with them. The health sector itself is well prepared, using the lessons we have learnt from earlier cases and the regional lockdowns to inform our planning and preparations. We do know what to do. Our DHBs all have summer preparedness plans in place. We have worked in the Ministry with our public health units to understand and prepare for the potential isolation and quarantine of cases and close contacts while people are away from home, and contact tracing for people who may have been at events or mass gatherings. We've also worked with event organisers to implement systems to support contact tracing should this be required, such as ensuring QR codes are available and being used at entrances, and capturing the details of attendances electronically where possible through the information in ticket sales. Of course, that then requires everyone, in terms of the QR code availability, to actually scan in using the codes. Please do so. Our core systems of testing, tracing and isolating are well established, and we know they work. We also know that we can scale up quickly if needed, and we have trained people and other resources on standby. Our border controls, as the Minister mentioned, are strong, and our health system is prepared to respond to any cases of COVID-19 that emerge. But, as we've said before, this is a tricky virus, and we all need to keep our eye on the ball to ensure our summer break can be enjoyed without restrictions. We are in an incredibly privileged position. While we have planned for a possible resurgence, let's stop it happening in the first place. Prevention is, as they say, better than cure. So I'm asking all New Zealanders to do their bit to make summer unstoppable. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you. Happy to open up for questions.
How worried are you about an outbreak during summer, considering people are moving around the country and there are big events like festivals?
Well, I'm not worried about an outbreak happening because I think our systems at the border are very tight. However, in these situations, you plan for the worst and do everything to ensure that, in fact, we don't get into that situation. I am confident in the planning that has happened across government and across the health system, and I am confident in our tracing and contact follow-up and our isolation systems. We've shown those can work, and we won't be taking any chances. What the key thing, though, is detecting any cases in the first place, and that's why it's very important that we maintain our testing volumes over summer, and that if people do have symptoms, they do get a test.
Scenario 3, what happens?
Mike, I'll let you follow up and then Mikey.
Just follow up here. Depending on, just going back to scenario 3, if there is a case, say at a music festival, and you have to keep people in place, what does that contingency plan look like in terms of holding people in that spot, and how long could they be there for?
So the situation here was that the scenario we have been tested, that someone actually tests positive once they've gone home from a festival, and that's the more likely thing that would happen, because an infection would be more likely to happen at the festival, detected once they get home. Clearly, in that sort of situation where we have New Zealanders dispersed right around the motu, that requires a national response. And so if there is an alert level change required, and that would be on a decision for Cabinet to make on our advice, then that would require a national alert level change.
Is there a likelihood that, say, if people are at a holiday destination, they'd have to stay put for a lockdown period then? Or would you facilitate people being able to move home? And
I think what we've said is it's going to depend on the circumstances, but the people need to have plans in the event that their return home is delayed. There could be a variety of reasons why it could be delayed, and it might only be a short delay, depending on the circumstances of what we were dealing with. If we were dealing with something, for example, that was localised within a campground, then we may say we want everyone to stay in that campground until we've got a handle on it. So those are the sorts of things where we just have to make sure that people have thought through all of the different scenarios in their own planning.
Back of that though, with the campground, if for example a family is there, will you be looking at accommodation support for example, because for some families things are tight at the moment. If they're asked to stay there for an extra week or so, that could push their budgets. Will you be looking at that?
Look, I mean, those are all things that we would deal with on a case-by-case basis. It's difficult to kind of predict every possible scenario. I think what the Director General has done is outlined 3 broad scenarios that we've used to make sure that our systems are ready to go. But of course, those will be customised depending on what situation may arise.
So should families then be looking at budgeting potentially for staying somewhere longer? Should they be putting that into their planning at the moment for summer?
Look, I think people should just be thinking about what would they do in the event that they couldn't get home by the date that they had planned to get home. Obviously, again, I want to reiterate, these are all worst case scenario plans, and we're all doing what we can to ensure that none of this ever eventuates. But it's always useful for people to have in the back of their minds, what would I do if something unexpected happened while I was away on holiday?
You've been working on this for a while, and you've been running, for lack of a better word, war games to see how this plays out. How long exactly has the government been planning for this summer?
Well, I mean, I think what you've seen over the course of the last year is as our knowledge of COVID-19 continues to grow and as our understanding of the different types of situations that we might face has continued to grow, we've continued to map out different scenarios. Before our August outbreak, we were looking at doing some simulations, if you like, to test our contact tracing systems. In the end, the August outbreak tested our systems pretty thoroughly. But we have always been looking at how do we make sure that we've got as many scenarios mapped out as we can, that we've really got an understanding of what we would do in different circumstances, bearing in mind, though, that you can never predict with great certainty what might have happened. Before the August outbreak, I don't think any of us would have predicted that that's quite what we would end up dealing with, so we had to adapt.
Usually the message of a summer for Kiwis is slip, slop, slap. What would the ministry's message to New Zealanders be this summer with the COVID threat?
And scan. Slip, slop, slap and scan.
If a scenario does happen and New Zealand was put back into lockdown, how would officials manage potentially hundreds of thousands of people travelling home to be at home lockdown?
Can I just comment there, Minister? So, we're in the situation at this time of year, different from back in March, where actually our borders, we know, are incredibly tight. And we know that if there is a case coming into New Zealand, it will be somewhere through the border, either through an aircrew or through a border worker becoming infected. We've had a number of these in recent months, and we have dealt with them all very quickly and managed to contain them. That's the situation that is most likely to happen. If there is, of course, a broader community outbreak, we would deal with that as we faced it, and that may include regional measures or it may include national measures depending on the nature of where that infection had occurred. I dare say, though, that I know that people have to adapt their holiday plans every year. We know if anyone like me has camped on the Coromandel around Christmas in a year, I've been evacuated from a campground in the middle of the night because of flooding, summer flooding. Likewise, the car can sometimes break down, sometimes things don't go to plan. Just make sure you know who can feed the cat or the dog and just what else you might need to do. And especially if you're in a remote location, that you may just take some extra supplies and try and keep in contact with the news just on a regular basis.
If a national response is required, have you mapped out how hundreds of thousands of Kiwis could travel home if we all went back into lockdown?
The same way that they would have travelled home anyway. If that was the situation that was arising, we would be giving that very careful consideration, but almost certainly we would be asking people to go back to their home base before we went up alert levels.
Consider calling off or perhaps scaling back festivals given the level of risk associated with them?
No, because the risk is ultimately quite low of anything happening in the first place. And so these are just precautionary things. I think if everyone is vigilant and just continues to take precautionary measures, I think we can relax over the summer because we're in a very good position as a country. So the things that we're talking about really are precautionary, but the risk profile wouldn't suggest that we needed to cancel the events.
Case scenario though, isn't it? In terms of the scanning in at the entrances of these festivals, is that mandatory or optional?
The organisers of the festival need to know that, need to make sure that we've got a way of getting in touch with people if we need to. Now, QR codes obviously are very helpful. Ticketed events are easier than unticketed events because in a ticketed event you'll be able to go back through the ticket information to find people. But yes, we do want event organisers to be encouraging people to use QR code scanning, to be encouraging people to turn on the Bluetooth functionality on their phones. Bearing in mind that at big festivals, for example, a QR code's only going to tell you that you were there. It's not necessarily going to tell you who you came into contact with, and that's where the Bluetooth could potentially be quite helpful.
But no, you can trace everyone that goes to a music festival, because if you can't trace everyone, then does that not bring up problems later on? So how confident are you that you will be able to trace everyone that goes to a festival?
Might ask the Director General to comment on that.
Well, I think that the Minister's pointed out that the technology is helpful in this regard, so the QR codes and the Bluetooth technology, but also the ticketing. Now, of course, some people on sell or give their tickets away. The key thing that has worked well for us, though, is our public communications, is reaching people through the media as well as through social media and word of mouth. So, I mean, we're confident that people would get the message and that anything that we're requiring people to do, that they would do it. And that includes if we're asking people to go and be tested. I should say that before we had the Auckland August outbreak, as the ministers alluded to, we were planning for a number of scenarios, and our worst case scenario that we were about to tabletop exercise was an outbreak in South Auckland. We had a real life example, and we were able to, through appropriate use of alert levels and through contact tracing and follow-up and isolation, to get around that outbreak. And if necessary, we would do that again.
We'll come over here.
So the Director General has confirmed that if in his worst case large-scale outbreak, which we agree is not likely to happen, Kiwis will be asked to go back home. So will they be given a certain amount of time to do that?
Look, it would depend on the circumstances. I think my main message here is if should anything happen, this will happen. And so we will then communicate exactly what we want, what we need people to do at the time based on the circumstances. So people just keep an ear out when they're on holiday, and we'll let them know if anything changes.
And just on the Trans-Tasman bubble, it only took an hour yesterday for the Australian Government through Health Minister Greg Hunt to come out, and he said, quote, "We are ready to implement from our side as soon as New Zealand is ready." Were you heartened by that message, and can it speed up the implementation of the bubble, knowing that Australia is red hot keen to go now?
Yeah, look, we're working very hard and very fast to make sure we can get that bubble open as soon as we can with Australia and also with the Cook Islands, where we've been also doing some work. I was at Auckland Airport this morning, going over with them their plans to separate the airport into two areas, so the health supervised zone, if you like, for people who are coming from non-safe zone countries, and the safe zone. And so I wanted to step through that very carefully, because obviously that's a key area for risk for us. We've got to make sure that we've got complete separation between anyone who's travelling in the safe zone and anyone who's travelling outside of the safe zone. And so I spent several hours with Dr. Verrill, accompanied me for that, just asking lots of questions and just going through that carefully. We're also talking to the airlines, because the airlines, as you'd imagine, they have their fleets grounded, and they have to bring their capability back up in order to be able to service something like the Trans-Tasman. And so we're talking to them about how soon they could operationalise that. And then, of course, we've still been working through those final details, so that when we do open up, we can tell people what would happen in the event of an outbreak, whether it was in New Zealand or in Australia. We have to be able to answer that with a degree of confidence, because people will need to know that when they're making their plans. For example, if they ended up having to stay, say they were going to the Gold Coast and they ended up having to stay longer in the Gold Coast because there was an outbreak there and there was no way for them to come home, they would need to know that. So those are all the things that we're working through, so we can give certainty at the point that we hit the go button, but we're working very quickly to try and make sure we've got those answers as fast as we can.
Pressing that go button. Is it Cabinet that presses that go button, or is it devolved now that you've had that discussion at Cabinet? Can you talk us through how that decision will be made?
No, it will be a Cabinet discussion in the first instance, although it's likely that we will reach a point where the finer kind of details end up having to be ironed out by ministers, and probably also with the Director General and his team providing final advice, but we're not quite at that point yet.
We'll
come up here and then I'll come back over
just
there.
on, I think it was Dr. Bloomfield, you talked about resources are on standby. What do you sort of mean by that? Is it something like response teams on standby to travel to certain areas, and if that is, what does that look like? How does that work?
Yeah, that's correct. One of the advantages of the national contact tracing solution is that we can delegate work from any region in the country to other regions, and so the on-call teams in every public health unit will be able to take work wherever they are. That is, case and contact follow-up work can be delegated out. But we also have people from both the public health units and also from our team in the ministry who can deploy out to support a public health unit in particular if they need support, if there's an outbreak in their region. So that's part of our planning, and those people are all on standby.
Okay, we'll come.
Are you concerned about a big drop-off in testing over summer if people are away? And are there any plans for surveillance testing if that does be the case?
So it's possible that that testing will drop off. And there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, over summer and people are outside a lot, there's less respiratory illness around, so that will reflect less people with symptoms. Our most important surveillance testing is the really thorough testing that is mandated and is now in place around the border, and so air crews, maritime and airports. So ports and airports, that will continue exactly as it has right through. So that will keep the testing volumes at a certain level. Other than that, the important thing is for people, if they are symptomatic, get a test, and they can find out from Healthline where the closest place to where they are is they can get a test.
You stressed the importance before, though, of getting tested in order to detect an outbreak over summer, but getting tested if you're sick isn't part of the government's ad campaign over summer. Why is that? And how, I guess, will you be encouraging New Zealanders over summer to get tested if they are sick?
You didn't read the fine print. In the stay home if you're unwell, it also says then seek medical advice as to whether or not you should get a test as part of that too. So we're saying to people, look, if you're not showing symptoms, then we don't want everybody rushing down to get tests all of the time. But actually, if there's reason for people to get a test, then Healthline is the first port of call there. Give Healthline a call; they'll tell you whether you should get a test and where you should go to get that test.
Festival runners will need to have some way of contact tracing attendees. Is that under a Section 11 order that they'll be required to do that, or is it not a requirement? It's just a strong encouragement.
No, I think from memory, there is a requirement in there.
There's a requirement for them to have the QR codes, and they will be, one of the advantages is that people entering events go past the security place and where they have to present their ticket, and they can be encouraged to scan the QR code, and that's the conversation that's been had with all event organisers.
You mentioned last week that you would take to Cabinet this week, or that you were discussing Cabinet this week, any possible widening of that mask mandate for public transport to other cities. Is that did that happen yesterday, and can we expect an announcement on that?
No, we'll be discussing that at Cabinet Business Committee tomorrow, so should have an answer for you on that by the end of the week.
Come down here.
Just on the fine print of the sort of the campground scenario, or so say you're a camper and you're at a campground in partial reception in the Coromandel, and you get an alert saying that an outbreak's happened in your campground or nearby. What actually happens? What do you see?
I think probably the first thing that's likely to happen in a scenario like that is the public health units will be on site very quickly should that happen, and you'd be getting advice there on site. Telling you what you should be doing. So if it was something very localised like that, but again, I'll ask the Director General to comment.
So the alert's much more helpful in a situation, for example, where someone's been in a restaurant or a bar or out shopping and they don't know the other people, or it's not easy to identify other people who might have been in that venue at the same time. In the situation of a campground or an event, it's much easier to identify, of course, the people who are there or who have been there, and as the Minister said, that's when there would be a local on-the-ground response, would be the first thing.
Out to wherever, out the sticks, and be testing people at the campground, telling them they can't leave until you're sure that no one else has the virus. Is that?
It's very situation dependent, but the public health units are now, we've had a year of doing this, and a large number of our public health units have had experience in doing this when they have had cases in the community earlier in the year.
Thresholds, like, if there's 5 cases obtained in this area, we'll do a regional, like a localised lockdown, or any sort of measurement in your mind?
Not number of cases. One case is enough to trigger a big response, and then it's once we've gathered information from further testing, isolation, contact tracing, then we would make a decision about anything around alert level changes, and that would be advice to Cabinet, who would make the decisions.
Okay, we'll do one more sweep of the room, starting on this side and moving our way across. So, yeah, go on then.
Thank you. How many people had entered New Zealand since the lockdown that haven't had to go through hotel quarantine? Or is there a certain class of people that haven't had to?
No, everybody. Sorry, since the
border closed.
Since the border closed back towards the beginning of the year. No, everybody who's come through has had to do that unless they're a part of an exemption. So unless they get an exemption, very, very few exemptions to that have been granted, and. The Director General is the one that grants them, so I don't think there's very many.
I've delegated that to MB. Well, I don't have the number, but we could get the latest number from MB, and those are on medical or compassionate grounds usually. Yeah. Diplomats, yes, they're encouraged to self-isolate. They don't have to, but they can use managed isolation.
I believe we're just on numbers. Do you have the COVID numbers for today? And I think it's been maybe like a month since we had the last community case. Does that make you feel safer heading into summer?
Yes, indeed. The fact that we haven't had a community case for some time, and that we are getting the cases in managed isolation, and given the scale of this outbreak abroad, in countries where people are travelling to New Zealand from, actually I'm surprised we're only getting the small numbers that we are in managed isolation. That may continue to increase, but the situation in our facilities is exactly the same. Everyone is considered to have COVID until proven otherwise.
for today, Jeff?
I don't have the
We
update
have
from
one
yesterday.
new
One
case in managed isolation today.
Absence payments, why was that necessary, and how's the Resurgence support payment different to the wage subsidy scheme?
So, I mean, the Minister of Finance has announced today some additional economic measures that are available to support people in the event that we end up having to escalate alert levels over the summer period, or indeed in the first part of next year. Probably the one bit that I can comment on is the fact that there is now a payment available to businesses whose staff need to isolate because they are awaiting a test result. It's a $350 payment, the upfront payment, non-refundable, so basically they'll get that money while their staff are having to support them to ensure their staff can isolate. And that's because we do acknowledge that if a business ended up with several staff having to be tested and having to isolate, that's a significant impost on that business, and we, particularly for a small business, so we want to be able to support them there. We don't want the financial cost to be an impediment to people doing what we're asking them to do, which is to isolate while they're waiting for a test.
Is that supposed to be passed through to the worker? Or
No,
is it for
no, but they should obviously be paid for the time that they're isolating. So if they're on sick, if they would be working during that period, for example, then they should be paid as if they were working during that period.
Ask what conversations you've had with airlines around their capacity of moving a large volume of New Zealanders, especially if they're spread out, and are you confident they have the capacity to do that if there is a change of alert levels and people need to go home?
I think, like the Director General said, people would need to be returning home in the event that that was what was required, returning home as they would have normally planned to do, but the timing might have been a little bit different. And we know from our last experience with this, Air New Zealand in particular worked very, very hard to make sure they helped to accommodate people's need to travel, and I'm sure that there would be goodwill there from them to help us to do that if we needed to do it.
If the public health units, and if there was an outbreak or a couple of cases that popped up in a small remote holiday town, how quickly could public health units mobilise and get there and start testing people?
Well, the public health units have people working every day through the break, and others on call if required, so they would be able to be there, of course, same day. And then our Resurgence sort of support, our team that might go in and help, the aim is to have them there to support if required within 24 to 48 hours. That's in addition to the ability for that work to be transferred around the country really right from day one.
So if there was a small outbreak at a campsite or a music festival, for example, people could realistically expect to stay there for a couple of extra days while everyone's tested and the test results come back?
Well, it depends. It very much depends on the situation, but that may well be the case. And as I said earlier on, weather events and other events happen every year, and people are really good, I know, at adapting, and I know that they will be supportive of whatever effort. This is nothing more or less than we've done before summer, right through the last few months. People have been incredibly supportive and helpful, and when asked, they have isolated, they have waited for tests, and then, depending on the results of those tests, done what's been asked.
Last question.
Are you convinced you've got a clear and coherent plan here? Because it's a little bit confusing to sort of ascertain what will happen in these various scenarios you're proposing.
Well, I mean, I think that the key message is that, it's impossible to map out every individual scenario that could potentially happen over the summer. What we've done is we've taken a variety of different scenarios. We've run our systems, run them through our systems to make sure that we're prepared. But we will have to adapt as we need to, depending on the reality of whatever might come up during that period of time.
So it's a bit of a wait and see.
Well, I think everything to do with COVID-19, when we're not dealing with cases, is a wait and see, but take lots of sensible precautions, which is probably, I think you want to
say, it's prepare
Yeah.
and see, not wait and see.
All right, that brings us to the end for today. This is, I hope, the last time we'll be standing here this year. So can I wish you all a good summer break? I'll be speaking to some of you later in the week in a different context, but can I thank all of you for helping us to convey our messages out to the New Zealand public over the last year, and wish you and everybody who's watching a very enjoyable summer break. Thank you.